In 2019, a plain-looking box sat in a Japanese airport. To anyone passing by, it was just another oversized equipment case. But this one wasn't carrying instruments. It was carrying a man, not just any man. Carlos Ghosn, Lebanese millionaire, global business legend, and the CEO of one of the most powerful car companies on earth, crouched inside that box, barely breathing, hoping no one would look too closely. How on earth did it come to this? How does a man who once commanded boardrooms across 2 continents end up smuggled out of a country inside a crate? That's exactly what we're going to find out, because this story has everything: a staggering rise to power, a ruthless betrayal, a conspiracy that goes all the way to the top, and an escape so unbelievable that Hollywood couldn't have written it better. Hey everyone, it's Mo, and I tell true, long-form, real-life stories on this channel. Enjoy! So let's go back to the beginning. Carlos Ghosn was born to Lebanese parents and somehow ended up holding 3 passports: Lebanese, French, and Brazilian. A man of the world before he'd even made his name. After finishing his education in France, he joined the legendary tire company Michelin. And from day one, it was clear this guy was different. He didn't just work, he climbed relentlessly until he reached the very top of Michelin's entire American operation. Think about what that means. A young man, foreign-born, working his way to the top of a major American division of a global corporation. That's not a career, that's a statement. Now Michelin moved in powerful circles, and the CEO of Renault, France's biggest automaker, started hearing the name Carlos Ghosn everywhere he turned. So he called him, made him an offer.
Come work for me. Be my deputy.
And in 1990, Carlos packed up and moved to France to become vice president of Renault. Here's the situation he walked into. Renault was dying. The company was hemorrhaging money, teetering right on the edge of bankruptcy. The entire French automotive industry was holding its breath. But then, within just 1 year of Carlos's arrival, everything changed. The company turned around. It was profitable again. So what exactly did he do? His philosophy was almost shockingly simple. Find the dead weight and cut it. Not rehabilitate it, not study it, cut it. He tore Renault apart and rebuilt it from scratch. Closed factories, laid off thousands of workers, triggered protests in multiple countries. The French press had a field day. They gave him a nickname that followed him for the rest of his career: Le Cost Killer, the Cost Cutter. It wasn't meant as a compliment, but Carlos wore it like a badge. Fresh off saving Renault, he set his sights on something bigger. He wanted the company playing at the very top table, competing with Ford, with Toyota, with the true global giants. And his plan was simple: find a major international partner and forge an alliance. He finally zeroed in on Nissan. Now here's the thing about Nissan at that moment. Yes, it was a famous name, but it was an absolute freefall. $20 billion in debt. Let that number sink in for a second. $20 billion. They were producing over 50 car models, and only 3 were actually making money. Everything else was a loss. Not one bank in Japan was willing to touch them. The whole industry was waiting for the funeral. Renault's proposal was straightforward. We'll buy a major stake in your company and keep you alive. The price? Renault would become the controlling shareholder. Now, if you know anything about Japanese culture and its fierce sense of national pride, you know that under any normal circumstances, this would never happen. A foreign company holding controlling power over a proud Japanese institution like Nissan? Unthinkable. But these weren't normal circumstances. Nissan was out of options, and Carlos knew it. He walked into the room and made them a promise.
Give me the company. I will make it profitable. Within 3 years, every single debt will be cleared. And if I fail, I resign. Not just from Nissan, from executive management permanently. Done?
Nissan had nothing left to lose. In 1999, Renault purchased roughly 37% of the company and took control. Carlos became CEO of Nissan, the first foreigner ever to lead one of Japan's most prestigious companies. Completely unprecedented. And here's the crazy part. He arrived in Japan and immediately went to work with the same ruthless efficiency. He personally visited every single factory. Within just 3 months, he had a complete turnaround plan ready. 5 factories shut down, 21,000 jobs gone. Protests erupted across the country. Campaigns against the Renault-Nissan alliance spread like wildfire. But Carlos didn't stop there. He went after something even more sacred: Japanese corporate culture itself. He made English the official working language of Nissan. He abolished the seniority system, that deeply rooted tradition where promotions were based on how long you'd been at a company, not how well you performed. He replaced it with pure merit, results only. Now logically, that makes complete sense. Practically, in Japan, that was borderline revolutionary. You can imagine the whispers in the boardroom.
Did you see his new restructuring plan? He's dismantling everything.
It is an absolute insult to our traditions.
Who does this foreigner think he is?
But here's the thing, it worked. Again, within a single year, exactly as he'd promised, Nissan was profitable. The narrative flipped completely. The man they'd called a butcher was suddenly a savior. They called him the man with the magic touch. A manga comic was made about him. It sold over 1 million copies. When Carlos walked into a restaurant in Japan, people would literally stand up and line up to greet him. That's about as famous as it gets. The years rolled by. Both companies kept growing. Then, in 2005, Renault's president stepped down. The successor was obvious. Carlos stepped up. And just like that, he became the simultaneous CEO of two of the world's largest car companies at the same time. Something that had never been done before in the history of the automotive industry. And the money, around $17 million a year. Now in the West, that's not shocking for someone running a global empire. But in Japan, his salary was 11 times what the president of Toyota made. Toyota, the biggest car company in the country. You can only imagine the quiet resentment bubbling beneath the surface in executive offices across Japan. And Carlos wasn't exactly shy about it. He owned a $10 million yacht, private jets, exotic cars. He threw lavish parties and lived beautifully, on money he had genuinely legally earned. But in Japan, where government ministers sometimes cycle to work out of modesty, this kind of visible wealth was jarring. It made people deeply uncomfortable. It made enemies. And those enemies were patient. Then came November 19th, 2018. Carlos was on his private plane when authorities boarded and arrested him. Just like that. He asked what the charges were. They said, financial corruption. He asked for specifics. Silence. They took him off his own plane and threw him in a cell. The story hit the world like a thunderclap. Nissan's stock immediately began to drop. Carlos sat in that cell, completely baffled, waiting for his own company to stand by him, to send lawyers, to defend him publicly. Instead, the board appointed a new president the very next day and fired him on the spot. The man who had saved Nissan twice had just been stabbed in the back by its own boardroom. He never saw it coming. Now, what were the actual charges? The headline accusation was that he had failed to properly declare compensation from the company, meaning he allegedly hadn't paid the appropriate taxes on it. But his regular salary had always been declared. The real issue centered on a retirement fund he'd set up, a future payout not yet received, with an amount that hadn't even been finalized yet. When authorities demanded to know why he hadn't disclosed it, his response was almost bewildered.
It hasn't been paid. The amount hasn't been decided. What exactly am I supposed to disclose?
Didn't matter. The authorities called it fraud. And here's what makes it feel wrong from the start. The case wasn't discovered. It was assembled, piece by piece. And the treatment that followed? Extraordinary. They put Carlos in solitary confinement. A man not yet convicted of anything, not charged with violence, not found guilty of a single thing, locked alone in a tiny cell in Kosuge prison for 3 months. Why? Because while he sat in that cell, the board of directors was running a coordinated media campaign against him. Properties bought in Paris, Beirut, and Brazil using company funds, they said. Carlos answered that the board had always known that running 2 global companies means you need operational bases around the world, and that those properties were legally owned by the company anyway, not him. Then they brought up the party. A lavish celebration at the Palace of Versailles for the 15th anniversary of the Renault-Nissan alliance, which also happened to fall near Carlos's birthday. The company now called it a personal birthday party billed to the corporation. Maybe Carlos did combine the two, but here's the question no one could answer. This party happened years ago. It was public. If it was embezzlement, why did the board say nothing at the time? Why only now? Because this was never really about the party, or the properties, or the retirement fund. So what was it really about? Here's what was actually happening. The French government had quietly acquired a significant stake in Renault, and inside Nissan's boardroom, Alarm bells were ringing. What if France pushed for a full merger, not an alliance, an absorption? Nissan swallowed whole by Renault, the Nissan name gone. For people who see their company as a point of national pride, that was an existential threat. And who was the one person capable of actually making that merger happen? Who had the connections, the authority, and the credibility on both sides? Carlos Ghosn, whether he wanted to pursue it or not. And ironically, he was actually against the idea. He believed both companies should remain independent, but the board didn't believe him, or didn't trust him, so they made their move. Overnight, 19 years of loyalty meant nothing. The savior became the villain, in Japan, in France, everywhere. And here's what makes it especially striking. The French government, whose own stake in Renault had triggered this entire chain of events, said absolutely nothing. No defense, no statement, no support. Renault itself went silent. Carlos was completely alone. Back in prison, the interrogations were relentless, sessions lasting 14 hours, sometimes no lawyer present, direct threats.
Confess, or we'll go after your wife and children.
Isolation, sleep disruption, psychological pressure, every tool in the playbook. He refused. For 3 months straight, he refused. Eventually, the Tokyo court granted bail, 2 billion yen, roughly $9 million. He paid the fee and walked out of Kosuge prison into a blinding wall of cameras, with helicopters tracking his car across the city. For weeks after, journalists camped outside his building. He and his wife were essentially prisoners in their own apartment. But he wasn't done fighting. He posted on Twitter announcing a press conference on April 11th, where he promised to step in front of the cameras, lay all his cards on the table, and tell the world exactly what happened. They genuinely could not allow him to speak publicly. He'd anticipated this. He'd already recorded a video to release in his place.
If you are listening to me through this video today, it means that I was not able to make the press conference. The first message is I'm innocent. This is a conspiracy. This is not about specific events. This is not about greed. This is about a plot. This is about conspiracies. This is about backstabbing. That's what we're talking about.
21 more days in jail, then a second bail, $5 million this time, $14 million total. But now came the conditions that showed exactly what this was really about. He was forbidden from contacting his wife. Any contact, a text, an email, a phone call, any of it. Immediate rearrest. Think about that. They weren't trying to prevent him from fleeing. They were trying to break him and remove the person closest to him, make him feel completely alone. It was psychological warfare dressed up in legal language. Carlos knew it immediately. He quietly arranged for his wife to fly back to Beirut, get her out of reach, get her safe, and then, alone in a house in Tokyo, banned from leaving the country, banned from calling his own wife, he began to think about the only option he had left. Because here's the math. In Japan, prosecutors win 99.4% of their cases, which mean the system never lose. A fair trial wasn't a long shot. It was a fantasy. Carlos would be convicted. That was the only possible outcome if he stayed. So he decided he wasn't staying. His first move? Securing a phone that didn't exist on any official record. He paid pure cash for an unregistered device, completely off the grid. And every single time he needed to make a call, he did it standing in his bathroom with the water running full blast. It was a highly effective trick to drown out any listening bugs the authorities might have planted. In the shadows, a secret team of 10 to 15 people slowly began to form around him. The first plan was an escape by sea. They scrapped it because it's too slow. Lebanon is too far for a boat. That left air. But Carlos couldn't go near an airport. No passport, no travel documents. Banned from international departure. How do you board a plane when your face is on every screen in the country? And every customs officer knows exactly who you are. The team started flying in and out of Japan on reconnaissance missions, different airports, different terminals, different times. They were studying the security procedures, looking for the crack in the wall. They studied Tokyo's main airport first, but it was a fortress, completely sealed, with absolutely no way through. But then they shifted their focus to Osaka. It was a smaller, less fortified target. And when they looked closely at Osaka's security, they found a truly remarkable flaw. The X-ray machines were only big enough to handle standard travel luggage, large cases, the kind used to transport concert equipment, speaker systems, instrument cases. They were too big to fit through the scanner. They weren't X-rayed, they were simply moved aside and waved through on visual inspection alone. That was it. That was the crack. Here's the plan they built around it. 2 men would pose as professional musicians. They'd fly into Osaka on a private jet, bringing their cases and equipment. Completely above board, completely normal. They'd tell customs they were there for a concert in Tokyo. Same day, they'd leave. Same airport, same officers, claiming they had a second show booked in Istanbul. In and out within hours. No red flags, nothing unusual. Except one of those cases would have Carlos inside it. The 2 men were later identified. Michael Taylor, former United States Special Forces, and George, reportedly a former soldier from Lebanon. These were serious operators, not amateurs. This wasn't improvised, it was a mission. Carlos had doubts, real ones. The plan seemed almost insane on paper, but when he worked through every other possibility, he kept arriving at the exact same answer. There was no other way. This was it. Now, there was still one major problem. His house was under heavy surveillance. He could literally see them from his window. Men sitting in black cars along the street, or standing on the pavement, just watching. He asked his lawyer if this was legal. The lawyer confirmed it was strictly illegal, but nearly impossible to prove, leaving Carlos with only one real option: weaponizing the press. They quietly tipped off journalists that surveillance agents were camped outside a prominent suspect's home. The moment reporters showed up with cameras, the watchers evaporated, refusing to risk being photographed. The journalists arrived, found nothing, and eventually left. And then, of course, the watchers came back. But Carlos now understood something crucial. He had a switch. Anytime he needed those men gone, he knew exactly how to make them disappear. Finally, in December 29th, 2019, there was just one last obstacle. Carlos's face was instantly recognizable across Japan. Distinctive foreign features in a country where standing out is the last thing you want. But it was the dead of winter, so he put on a heavy coat, a wool hat, and a medical mask. It was completely unremarkable in Japan during cold weather, making him completely unrecognizable. He made the call to the journalists, telling them,
"The surveillance team is outside my house. Come quickly. This is your chance."
The watchers somehow received word and melted away before the cameras even arrived. And the moment Carlos saw them go, he walked straight out his front door, calm, unhurried, just a masked figure in a winter coat, disappearing into the city. He made his way to the Grand Hyatt Hotel, where George and Michael were already waiting with the case. They ran a dry run, having Carlos climb in to check the fit. Could he breathe? Could he stay still long enough? After drilling a few additional holes for air circulation and changing into lighter clothes, he finally got inside. A white sheet was laid over him as a last-ditch measure, just in case anyone opened the lid and glanced inside without looking too closely. Then, the case was locked. Hotel staff were called to bring it downstairs, with the men warning them to be extremely careful, saying,
Be careful, fragile, irreplaceable instruments inside.
The case was loaded onto a truck alongside a second identical case that actually did contain real speakers, and together, they drove to the airport. At the terminal, the cases were unloaded and moved toward customs. Inside his case, Carlos lay completely still, just listening to the muffled sound of Japanese conversation and the scrape of wheels on a hard floor. And then, they stopped, the checkpoint. He heard one of his men speaking to the officers, their voice warm, relaxed, and almost cheerful.
Thank you so much for all your help this morning. We really appreciate it.
When the officers began asking about the cases, the men calmly explained that they were instruments that had already been cleared through customs earlier that morning on arrival. They insisted they were the exact same cases with the exact same contents, leaving now after the Tokyo show, with their next stop being Istanbul, and then with just the right touch of polite urgency.
These instruments are extremely delicate. Any rough handling and the tuning is ruined. We have a show in Istanbul tomorrow. Please, we can't afford any delays.
Inside the case, Carlos heard 2 officers start joking. One said,
"These guys are probably smuggling beautiful women in there."
There was laughter, followed by the sound of bags passing through an X-ray machine. And then, movement. As the case finally rolled forward, they were through. Carlos himself would later admit that the plan should not have worked, but everything somehow broke their way. It was the end of the year, meaning they were dealing with a skeleton crew. The experienced veterans were all on holiday leave, so the people staffing those checkpoints that night were the newest, least seasoned officers. The stars had aligned in the most improbable way. Once the cases were loaded onto the private jet, Carlos stayed locked inside until he was absolutely certain they were airborne. He spent 30 agonizing minutes in total darkness, motionless, listening and barely breathing while terrified that the door would open or the air would run out. But then the engines roared, the plane began to move, and finally, liftoff. The moment the wheels left Japanese soil, a team member unlatched the case, allowing Carlos to climb out and move to the sealed rear cabin. Someone handed him water and food, and he sat back, breathing freely for the first time in what felt like years. In Istanbul, a new contact met him directly on the tarmac. There was no terminal and no passport control. He went straight to a connecting flight to Beirut for one last hour in the air. Stepping off the plane in Lebanon, a customs officer recognized him immediately. Here, Carlos wasn't just famous, he was embraced. People had hung banners with his name in the streets when his ordeal began, so the officer simply smiled and welcomed him home. Carlos had made it. He was finally reunited with his family. And within hours, the story detonated across the globe. Japan's authorities were left flat-footed, charging his lawyers with negligence for failing to monitor their client, which wasn't remotely their responsibility. Interpol issued a red notice at Tokyo's request, but Lebanon doesn't extradite its citizens. Carlos was home, and he was staying. A few days later, he stood before cameras at a press conference in Beirut, composed, measured, and absolutely furious in the most controlled way imaginable. He laid out everything: the arrests, the solitary confinement, the marathon interrogations, the threats against his family, the fabricated charges, and the boardroom betrayal. And then he delivered the line that echoed around the world: "I did not flee justice. I fled the absence of justice." Since that day, he's given interviews everywhere: Arab networks, European outlets, and American broadcasters. A documentary was made about his case, and he has spoken freely about everything, except one thing: the mechanics of the escape. He protects that detail fiercely, because the people who helped him are still out there, and they deserve to stay safe. Lebanon offered Japan a deal to send the case files so Carlos could face trial on Lebanese soil, but Japan refused. They want him back, and they are still waiting. Carlos lives in Lebanon today. The Interpol warrant is still active, meaning he cannot set foot outside the country without risking immediate arrest. France has even added its own warrants following internal inquiries connected to Renault. And yet, through all of it, not a single piece of hard public evidence has emerged that conclusively proves any of the charges leveled against him. He has been transparent at every turn, while the system that pursued him has not. Guilty or innocent, we may never know the full truth. The complete picture might never surface unless someone, someday, decides to put every card face up on the table. Until that day, this is where the story stands. And with that, we've reached the end of today's deep dive. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a case. If you're looking for more unbelievable true stories, click on one of the videos on your screen right now, like the brilliant Banco Rio bank heist in Argentina, or the intense 1971 plane hijacking over South Korea. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.